Okay, let's get started with our discussion of biomass. And what are we talking about when we talk about biomass? We are talking about a wide variety of things. We're talking about wood or charcoal, and charcoal we can make from wood. We're talking about animal dung, manure, plant leavings like the corn stalks that get left behind when we harvest our corn crops. We're talking about biofuels. These are actually things that we put in the gas tanks of our cars. Like ethanol. Ethanol is one of the ones that you hear about. We have this all throughout the Midwest United States. E85 is what it's called. It's 15% ethanol and it's 85% gasoline. But we make this ethanol by simple fermentation, just like we make alcohol. We make this ethanol from corn. Here in our country, that's almost solely what we make our ethanol from. In Brazil, they use sugarcane because that's their number one crop. And they are using ethanol almost exclusively in Brazil. Switchgrass is something that you hear talked a lot about because it's a plant that is very easy to grow. So it grows in a wide variety of climates. It grows very, very quickly. So it comes back fast. And of course, then we take this grass and we process it, have it go through the fermentation process to make ethanol. Some vehicles are called flex fuel vehicles. And if you buy a vehicle that runs on flex fuels, it can run on either ethanol or gasoline. You hear a lot about biodiesel now. Biodiesel is a little bit different. That fuel is really based on algae and this other called straight vegetable oil, which is there's a picture in the book of a college group that runs their bus on straight vegetable oil. Now, usually this vegetable oil is recycled. It's used from restaurants and places like that operate deep fryers. The reason that algae is so attractive to us as a potential biofuel is because it grows everywhere, and we can actually have algae farms. We can actually grow algae for the sole purpose of smashing it down, processing it, and using it as a form of energy to move our cars. It's called biodiesel. It's a direct substitute for gasoline. Ethanol is not. Ethanol gets mixed with gasoline. But biodiesel is a direct substitute for petroleum-based products. Sometimes you'll hear this biodiesel fuel called B20. All right, now let's talk about these other terms that are in your book. First, modern versus fossil carbon. The idea here is very simple. There's carbon that we're growing right now, right, in the form of trees, in the form of plants. They're undergoing photosynthesis and making glucose. That's where the carbon comes from. It's in the glucose. That's modern carbon because it's in our lifetime type of thing. Of course, we have the other kind we've already talked about, fossil fuel carbon, and that's carbon that's down deep in the earth. It's buried. It's not in our immediate accessible environment. So every time we access fossil carbon, we're taking carbon that belongs in the ground and we're releasing it. We're using it to our advantage. We're harvesting it. And of course, what ends up happening when we burn those fossil fuels, that carbon is released in the form of carbon dioxide, which we are then adding to the atmosphere. So we are inadvertently changing the carbon cycle and taking carbon that was meant to be buried deep in the ground and getting it back into the atmosphere. Anytime you have a process in which the carbon that you use has no effect on the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, it's considered to be carbon neutral. You hear that phrase a lot. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about taking a carbon-based product, using it for energy, but it's not releasing very much CO2. And then they mention in the book crop residue. Crop residue is a potential for some very good energy source. And after all, that's just being left behind. It's nothing that anybody's going to use. So why not collect all that up, process it, and burn it for energy? So this is the different biomasses that we're talking about. All right, no fooling around. Let's get right into it. This is about using biomass, and it is energy from the sun. Biomass, of course, bio means living, so it's all the living things that give us energy. And of course, because all the biomass contains carbon, that's what we're talking about here. For instance, fossil fuels. You can see here, that's photosynthesis. That's solar energy. Like I said before, you can make the case that all of our energy is solar. But because of photosynthesis in ancient plants and algae, we have our non-renewable energy sources, the fossil fuels. All right, then we can see the other solar energies. Of course, these are renewable energy sources, but they are not all biomass. This using the direct solar energy is not biomass. Wind and hydroelectric is not biomass. Heating from the ground is not biomass. However, these ones are. Wood, charcoal, other plant products, burning the leavings from agriculture, for instance, making biofuels out of plants, for instance, sugarcane. And of course, there is some that's ingested by animals, and indeed, in many places in the world, manure is actually used and burned. Now these last two energy sources are not solar, as this diagram indicates. By the way, this is on page 350 in your textbook, if you're following along in your textbook. These are not solar, but again, I can make the case that if it wasn't for the sun, we wouldn't have fissionable materials, we wouldn't have uranium, and heck, if we didn't have the sun, we wouldn't have a moon to give us the tidal energy. So in any event, what we're going to be talking about now are these energy sources here: wood, manure, charcoal, and biofuels. This shows you where the places are in the world where they live on biomass. When you think of biomass as an energy source, you should think primarily of wood. And indeed, many places in the world, people burn wood for their energy, plain and simple. I mean, they burn wood to heat their home. They use wood to boil their water because they don't have a solid water source, a good safe water source, so they have to boil their water first. And of course, they'll use wood to cook. And so this data here shows you the places in the world, the percent share of biomass for living. And it should not surprise you that it's the developing world that we're talking about here. We're talking about Central Africa, we're talking about Southwest Asia, we're talking about India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. These countries, they have to use wood, and if they're not using wood, see, this is wood fuels here. If they're not using wood, they're using charcoal or they're using manure, animal dung, D-U-N-G. There are advantages to burning biomass as fuels. If the substance is harvested and burned sustainably, then there's no net CO2 increase when you burn it. It's moderate in cost. There's a large supply as long as you are sustainable with it. And that's what this bullet here is. It's not renewable if it's harvested unsustainably, if you cut down more trees than you can grow. It does have an environmental impact, obviously. You have to go in and cut down forests. You have to cut down the trees. Many people harvest and burn unsustainably, so the CO2 emissions overall are up. You have low photosynthetic efficiency. You don't get a whole lot of energy from plants doing photosynthesis. You get some, but certainly not the kind of energy we need to operate a factory or to boil water. There's soil erosion when we cut down trees. You remember all the things that we learned about concerning deforestation. Water pollution from runoff, loss of habitat. All of these things are a negative to using wood as an energy source. All right, I think that just about covers this slide for you. Ethanol has some pros and cons. I'll talk more about ethanol in a couple of minutes, but you can see from this diagram here what the advantages and disadvantages are of ethanol. There is some reduction in CO2 emissions when you burn ethanol instead of gasoline, and it's much lower in carbon monoxide, which we talked about when we did our human health chapter. You can mix ethanol with gasoline, and that will help make our supply of oil last much longer. And of course, ethanol is potentially renewable, again, if we are sustainable with our cultivation practices. But there are many disadvantages. You can't go as far on a tank of ethanol, so you need a larger fuel tank. It's a net energy loss. It takes a lot of energy to harvest these crops, shown in this picture here, and turn it into something that's usable at the pump. So it's much higher cost. We have to worry about using corn, for instance, is what we get our ethanol from, and we have to worry about the potential of using corn for this source, and then people might starve to death. And that's what this bullet's talking about here. We'll have people starving in developing nations because they need that corn to survive. So there is a limited supply of corn. There's more nitrogen emissions with with ethanol, and it's corrosive to your engine. So we have not worked out all the bugs when it comes to ethanol, and yet in the middle of the United States, in corn country, we find lots of gas stations that sell ethanol, and people that drive cars that use ethanol. This picture here is just showing you charcoal, and it's more valuable and of better use than wood is in the burning of, for fossil fuels. For biomass. And the reason that is because there's less smoke when you burn charcoal instead of wood. You get more heat out of charcoal than you do from wood. Charcoal is lighter than wood is. So a lot of countries have factories that make charcoal, and they get that out of the ground, or they'll burn trees to make the charcoal. In the long run, it burns a little bit more efficiently for people in developing countries. One of the problems with burning wood, you probably noticed if you've ever been to a bonfire or something like that, or maybe even had a fire in your house, in the fireplace, that is, that particulates, ash, comes out of the smokestack when you burn wood, just like it does with coal. So if you're operating burning wood for a lot of your energy source, you can end up with piles of ash on the ground, on top of buildings, etc. And in the book they mentioned this school group that actually took vegetable oil and they actually run their vehicles on vegetable oil, veggie power they call it. And what they do is they get used oils from restaurants and fast food places. And this is that old story that you hear about when people talk about when you drive a car like this, it smells like a deep fryer because this vegetable oil you're using is not clean. We're recycling it. We're using it from restaurants and places like that. All right, so I guess I can end this here with the biomass and biodiesel. If you have any questions about any of these things, please jot them down and bring them to class. Next up will be hydroelectric power. And we'll do that in the next video.